My son-in-law stood at the head of the conference table like he'd just been handed the keys to the Pentagon, except he hadn't been handed anything, he'd inherited it by marrying into it. And the first thing he did with that power was point his finger directly at me and say, in front of every department head in the building, "Gary, you're done. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out. 16 years. 16 years of keeping Hartwell Manufacturing supply chain breathing, and I got cut loose by a man who'd been with the company for 14 months and still called our primary raw material supplier by the wrong name at every quarterly meeting. I'm Gary Whitmore, 54 years old, and I spent the better part of 2 decades as Director of Vendor Operations and Supply Chain Compliance at Hartwell Manufacturing. Spent being the relevant word. I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice, didn't give Marcus the reaction he was clearly waiting for, the one that would let him tell the story later about how the old guard couldn't handle change. I just pulled my badge from my lanyard, set it flat on the conference table, slid my building access card next to it, and stood up straight. My father was a high school shop teacher in Dayton, Ohio, for 31 years. He taught me that how you leave a room matters as much as how you entered it. Good luck, I said, not sarcastically, just honestly, because they were going to need it. What Marcus didn't know, what nobody sitting around that conference table fully understood, was that my badge and my building access card were the least important things I just handed over. I drove home on the 405 with the windows down, even though it was November and the San Fernando Valley had finally decided to act like it had seasons. I wasn't angry yet. That comes later, usually around 2 in the morning when you've replayed the scene enough times to notice all the details you missed in the moment. What I felt sitting in that traffic was something quieter, something closer to the feeling you get when you watch someone about to step off a curb without looking. My wife was in the kitchen when I got home. She knew before I said anything. 16 years of marriage, and she reads me the way I read a vendor contract, straight to the clause that actually matters. She poured me a cup of coffee, sat down across from me, and said, "How bad is it going to be for them?" I thought about it for a moment. "Depends on how fast they figure out what they don't know," I said. She nodded. She'd heard enough dinner table conversations about supply chain architecture to understand what that meant. Let me explain what Marcus thought he was firing. He thought he was eliminating a middle-aged procurement manager who was resistant to his digital transformation strategy, which mostly involved replacing working systems with more expensive software that did the same thing with a better dashboard. He thought I was overhead. Legacy thinking in a fleece vest. He'd said as much in a leadership meeting 2 weeks prior, not knowing I was still on the call because his assistant had forgotten to remove me from the invite. "Gary represents everything we need to move away from," he'd told the assembled VPs. "Relationship-based vendor management is a relic. We need systems-based procurement." What he was actually firing was the sole authorized signatory on 47 active vendor contracts. The only company representative with EPA-certified compliance credentials registered with 3 federal oversight bodies. The person who had spent 16 years building personal relationships with suppliers who had no contractual obligation to continue working with Hartwell Manufacturing if those relationships changed hands improperly. And the only human being at Hartwell who knew about the raw material substitution issue that our polymer supplier had flagged to me, quietly, 8 weeks earlier, an issue I had been managing carefully and confidentially while I figured out the cleanest way to address it without triggering a formal recall process. That last part is the one that kept me up at night, not for Marcus's sake. For the 1,600 people who worked on Hartwell's production floor, I spent that first evening at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, writing down every active vendor relationship, every compliance registration, every regulatory contact, every pending issue I'd been carrying in my head and in my files. Not because I was planning anything, because I'm a supply chain professional, and documenting handover procedures is what supply chain professionals do. The irony was that nobody had asked me to do it. Nobody at Hartwell even knew I was doing it. That's the thing about institutional knowledge. The people who don't have it are always the last ones to understand its value. My former employer began experiencing what I can only describe as a very orderly unraveling. It started on Thursday morning, 2 days after my termination, when I got a call from my longtime contact at Meridian Polymers, the company that supplied the specialty resin compound used in 60% of Hartwell's product line. His name was Dale, and we'd been working together for 11 years, through 2 recessions, a plant fire in 2019, and a global shipping crisis that would have broken the relationship if it hadn't been built on something more durable than a purchase order. "Gary," he said, "I'm going to be straightforward with you. We got a contract renewal notice from Hartwell this morning, and it came through some automated procurement portal with a digital signature from someone named Bryce in purchasing. Okay, I said. Bryce didn't exist in our system 2 days ago. You were our authorized contact. You were the signatory on the master supply agreement. Now they're trying to process a renewal through a portal we've never interacted with before. And when our compliance team tried to verify the authorization, they got a bounce-back error because the signatory credentials don't match what's registered with us. I told Dale I was no longer with the company. Silence on his end. Gary, are you serious? Effective Tuesday. Another silence. The kind that happens when a man who has been doing business long enough to know what it means is doing the math in his head. They have a shipment scheduled for the 14th, he said finally. I know. I can't release that shipment without verified authorization from a recognized signatory. Our legal team will not allow it. And the contract renewal that's supposed to cover the next 18 months is now in a gray area because the person attempting to execute it isn't credentialed with us. I told him he should call Hartwell's main line and ask to speak with whoever was now handling vendor relations. He thanked me. He sounded the way people sound when they already know the answer to a question they haven't asked yet. The second call came Friday afternoon from my contact at AeroCert, the third-party certification body that managed Hartwell's EPA product compliance documentation. Her name was Patricia, and she was not calling to chat. We received a request this morning to transfer primary signatory authority on your company's certification portfolio to someone named Marcus Devlin, she said. I need you to verify whether this request is legitimate and whether you authorize the transfer. I didn't authorize it, I said. I'm no longer with the company. Gary. Her voice shifted. The transfer of EPA certification authority isn't something you can just process by submitting a form. There's a verification protocol. The outgoing authorized officer has to file a formal separation notice with us and co-sign the transfer documentation. It takes a minimum of 30 days. If the outgoing officer simply stops appearing in our system without proper separation documentation, the certifications go into a compliance hold. I understand. Do they understand? I told her I couldn't speak to what Hartwell understood. She told me she would be sending a formal notice of compliance hold to the company's registered address, and that any products certified under the affected credentials could not legally be represented as EPA compliant until the hold was resolved. I thanked her. She said she was sorry this happened to me, which I appreciated more than I expected. The compliance hold notice arrived at Hartwell on Monday. I know this because my former assistant, a sharp young woman named Keisha, who had been with me for 4 years and was one of the most capable people in the building, texted me from her personal phone. She'd been trying to do the right thing for the company she still worked for, which I respected. Gary, there's a letter from AeroCert and people here are very confused. Marcus is saying it's a clerical error. Is there anything I can tell them that will help? I told her to have whoever was in charge of compliance call AeroCert directly and ask for Patricia. I told her to write down 3 words. Formal separation notice. I told her to make sure those 3 words got to someone with the authority to act on them. Beyond that, I said, I genuinely could not be involved. She texted back. They promoted Bryce to head of vendor relations. He's 26. I put my phone face down on the counter and went for a walk. Here is the thing that most people who haven't spent time in regulated manufacturing don't appreciate. A compliance hold on EPA certifications doesn't just mean paperwork trouble. It means that any product currently in distribution that carries those certification claims is now in legal jeopardy. It means retailers who stock those products are exposed. It means Hartwell's biggest accounts, the ones that specified EPA certification as a contractual requirement, had grounds to review their agreements. I know this because I'd spent 16 years making sure it never happened. Hartwell's largest retail account was a national home improvement chain that represented roughly 38% of the company's revenue. They had a sustainability compliance team that reviewed supplier certifications on a quarterly basis. Their next review was scheduled for the 3rd week of November. I knew this because I had the date on my calendar and had been preparing documentation for it since September. I wondered if Bryce knew about the review. The call from Ray Hartwell himself came on a Wednesday evening, 12 days after my termination. Ray was 71 years old and had built his company from a 2-man operation in a Burbank warehouse into a regional manufacturing outfit with a facility in 3 states. He was also, genuinely, one of the better human beings I'd encountered in business. His only significant error of judgment, as far as I could tell, was believing that a man who'd married his daughter and displayed sufficient confidence in meetings was qualified to run an operation he'd spent 40 years building. "Gary," he said, "I owe you an apology." "Ray, no, let me say it. What Marcus did was wrong. The way he did it was worse. I've been traveling, and I came back to a situation I don't fully understand yet, and I'd like to understand it. Can we meet?" I agreed to meet him for breakfast the next morning. Not because I was considering going back, but because I respected Ray, and because there were things he needed to hear from someone who would tell him the truth. We met at a diner in Woodland Hills, the kind of place with laminated menus and coffee that arrives before you ask for it. Ray looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the early hour. He ordered eggs he barely touched and asked me to tell him what was happening. I walked him through it methodically. The vendor credentialing problem at Meridian Polymers, the EPA compliance hold at AeroCert, the retail account sustainability review coming in November. I watched his face as each piece landed, and what I saw wasn't anger at me. It was the slow, settling weight of understanding. "How long to fix it?" he asked. "Properly? 3 to 4 months minimum. You need to file the separation documentation with AeroCert, get a new authorized officer credentialed, which requires their own background check and a 30-day verification period. You need to re-establish vendor authorization with Meridian and the other affected suppliers, which means going through their compliance intake process again. And you need to brief your retail accounts sustainability team before their November review, which is in 11 days, or you risk a contract review that you are currently not positioned to survive." Ray was quiet for a moment. "Marcus said it was clerical errors," he said. "It's not clerical errors, Ray." "I know." He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "What about the other thing? The polymer issue you mentioned before all of this happened." And there it was. The thing I had been waiting for someone at Hartwell to ask about. The thing that had kept me up more than anything else. 8 weeks before my termination, Dale at Meridian Polymers had contacted me with a quiet concern. Their primary raw material supplier had made an undisclosed formulation change to one component of the resin compound they were selling us. The change was within allowable variance ranges, on paper, but Dale had a hunch, and Dale's hunches were worth paying attention to, that it might affect the long-term performance characteristics of finished products made with that compound. Nothing that would show up immediately, something that might show up in 18 to 24 months of field use. I had been in the early stages of commissioning an independent materials analysis to either confirm or rule out the concern. I had not yet escalated it internally because I wanted to bring a complete picture rather than a preliminary concern that might cause panic. I had not disclosed it to Marcus during my termination because Marcus had not given me the opportunity to brief him on anything. He'd had security walk me to my car. I told Ray everything, every detail, every date, every conversation with Dale, every step of the analysis I'd been setting up. I handed him the folder I'd brought with me, which contained the documentation I'd compiled over those 8 weeks. Ray looked at the folder for a long time without opening it. "You didn't have to bring this," he said. "No," I said, "but 1,600 people work in your facilities, Ray, and consumers use your products. I wasn't going to sit on it." He opened the folder then. Read through it carefully, with the focused attention of a man who'd spent decades reading documents that mattered. When he finished, he set it down and looked at me. "What do we do?" "You commission the full materials analysis immediately. You loop in your product liability counsel. You contact Meridian and get a hold placed on the affected compound batches until you have results. And depending on what the analysis shows, you may need to get ahead of it with your retail accounts and possibly with CPSC. The Consumer Product Safety Commission." "Yes, Gary." He folded his hands on the table. "I want you to come back. Whatever Marcus decided, I'm countermanding it. Name your terms." I had thought about this moment, not because I'd anticipated it exactly, but because I'd spent enough years in operations to know that moments like it were possible, and I'd learned long ago that you don't make important decisions in the moment they're offered to you. "I appreciate that, Ray," I said. "I genuinely do. But I have to be honest with you. It's not about Marcus. Not really. It's that in 2 years or 5 years, when the situation stabilizes, there'll be another Marcus. Someone else who looks at what I do and decides it's overhead. I can't keep building something on a foundation that someone else decides the value of." Ray looked like a man hearing something he'd suspected but hadn't wanted confirmed. "What are you going to do?" "I filed paperwork last week for Whitmore Supply Chain Advisors. I have 2 clients already, both in regulated manufacturing. I can help Hartwell through this as a consultant." I can help you navigate the compliance holds, manage the retail account relationship through November, and oversee the materials analysis process. But I can't come back as an employee." He agreed. Not immediately, and not without trying once more to change my mind, but he agreed. We shook hands in the parking lot of that diner on a Thursday morning, and I drove home knowing that the next 6 months of my professional life were already more structured than I'd expected when I walked out of that conference room 2 weeks earlier. I want to be honest about something, because I've seen enough of these stories told by other people, about other situations where the protagonist gets to be entirely clean and righteous, and the antagonist gets to be cartoonishly wrong, and real life isn't quite that simple. I could have handled the transition differently. I could have insisted on a proper briefing before I left. I could have sent an email to Keisha or the general counsel outlining the critical open items. I chose not to, partly because I was hurt and partly because nobody asked me to, and I've thought about whether that was the right call. Here's what I decided. I owed the company a professional exit, which I gave them. I owed the company's workers and customers disclosure of a potential safety issue, which I gave Ray the moment he asked. I didn't owe Marcus Devlin a tutorial on everything he'd failed to learn in 14 months of collecting a salary I could tell you the exact dollar amount of because I'd reviewed the executive compensation disclosures myself. The materials analysis came back in the 3rd week of November. The formulation change was real, and the concern was legitimate, not a crisis, but something that warranted a proactive notice to affected retail accounts and a voluntary replacement program for products from 2 specific production runs. Handled correctly, it was manageable. Handled incorrectly, it could have become a Consumer Product Safety Commission inquiry and a class action waiting for a plaintiff. Because Ray had looped in counsel early and because I was there to help structure the communication to retail accounts, it was handled correctly. The home improvement chain's sustainability team, when I briefed them personally, appreciated the transparency enough to maintain the relationship under a temporary compliance bridge agreement. It cost Hartwell money. It cost them some goodwill they'll spend years earning back. But it didn't cost them the account, and it didn't cost anyone their health, and both of those things matter more than the quarterly numbers. Marcus was removed from his position as CEO in December. The board's language was careful, strategic realignment of leadership, but Keisha told me what the staff meeting actually sounded like, and it sounded like a man being read the results of a very long report that had his fingerprints on every problem and his solutions on none of them. Ray came back as active chairman. He brought in an interim CEO with an actual operations background, a woman who had spent 20 years in regulated manufacturing and knew what a compliance hold was before someone had to explain it to her. I heard Marcus was consulting now, something in the startup space. I genuinely hope he finds something he's good at, because everyone deserves to find that, and because companies deserve leadership that fits the work, not the other way around. By January, Whitmore Supply Chain Advisors had 7 clients. By March, 11. The federal contracting world and the regulated manufacturing world are smaller than they look from the outside, and word moves through them the way water moves through limestone, quietly, persistently, finding every crack. When Hartwell's situation made the trade press, a brief item in a supply chain industry publication about compliance gaps in mid-market manufacturing, my phone started ringing from companies that had their own versions of the same vulnerability and hadn't admitted it yet. I took on a partner in February, a woman I'd known for years who had run procurement compliance for a medical device manufacturer and brought a level of technical depth in FDA-regulated supply chains that complemented what I was doing in the EPA and consumer product space. We rented a proper office in Encino, had business cards printed with a real logo, hired Keisha away from Hartwell with a salary that was frankly embarrassing in how much better it was than what they'd been paying her. Ray Hartwell called me in April. Not about the compliance work, which was largely wrapped up by then. He called to tell me he'd been thinking about our breakfast conversation, specifically about what I'd said about building something on a foundation that someone else decides the value of. "I think I made that mistake with you," he said. "I let someone else define your value inside my own company, and I didn't pay attention until it was almost too late. It worked out, Ray. For you it did," he said. "I'm still rebuilding." He asked if I had any advice for how to prevent it from happening again with other people, with other roles. I told him the same thing I'd been telling the clients who hired me to assess their operational vulnerabilities. You document, you cross-train, you make sure no single person is the only holder of critical relationships and critical knowledge. Not because the people who hold that knowledge aren't valuable, they're the most valuable people you have, but because building redundancy is how you honor that value rather than exploit it. When someone is the only one who knows how something works, That's not a testament to their competence. That's a management failure waiting to happen. He was quiet for a moment. You should write that down somewhere, he said. I put it in every engagement report, I told him. I hung up and looked out the window of my office at the San Fernando Valley spread out below, doing what it always does, which is shimmer and sprawl and persist without asking anyone's permission. There's a particular kind of satisfaction that comes not from winning, but from being exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly the work you know how to do, on terms that you set yourself. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It arrives quietly, the way the right solution to a complex procurement problem arrives, not with drama, but with the clean, settling clarity of something that simply fits. My calendar that afternoon had 3 client calls, a proposal review, and a dinner with my wife at a restaurant I'd been promising her since Thanksgiving. Sometime around 4 o'clock, my assistant forwarded me an email inquiry from a company I recognized immediately, a regional manufacturing outfit in Phoenix that had recently parted ways with their head of supply chain compliance and was now, according to the inquiry, experiencing some unexpected difficulties with their vendor credentialing process. I looked at the email for a moment. Then I forwarded it to my partner with a note that said, "Standard intake, schedule a discovery call for next week." My calendar was already full enough.